Welcome for everybody here. So tonight we're looking at kind of a sample lecture of what I'll be teaching coming up in January on teaching Austrian economics. And a lot of people, family and friends, have been asking me recently, well, what's Austria? Are you going to Austria? But a lot of the thinkers are Austrians, and so that's why it's called that. And they make some really unique contributions. And what we'll be looking at tonight is the labor theory of value, which is kind of the foundational idea of Karl Marx's communism, of the kind of the economic idea that he gets his whole kind of builds his whole theory on top of the ideas of exploitation and his concerns about capitalism and all these things. And so we'll be looking at that, and I'll be hopefully providing a critique of it, an internal critique of it, because sometimes people say, well, Marxism or communism and their economics and their philosophy, it's not good, but they don't always say why. Sometimes they just restate, okay, this is Marxism, this is cultural Marxism, this is, it doesn't work economically, but they don't always explain why. And what I'll be looking at is that not only is Marx's labor theory of value insufficient, it's actually self-defeating. I joke, but it's true that Karl Marx is actually the best critic of his own theory, because he shows with his labor theory of value why it's not true. And if the labor theory of value isn't true, and that's kind of the cornerstone of Marxist and communist economics, if the labor theory of value comes down, everything comes down, as far as I'm concerned. So we'll go ahead and look into this, because there actually are some things to appreciate about Marx's insights as far as the labor theory of value. He just isn't consistent. He doesn't apply them correctly. But anyway, let's look at what this idea of the labor theory of value is, and I can provide this PowerPoint to anybody who would like that, if you want to have that accessible at another time. But like I said, the whole economic and philosophical worldview of what you might call Marxist communism rests on this idea of the labor theory of value. And I'll talk about in depth kind of what that is, but basically it's kind of an idea that kind of seems to make some sense. It's this idea that if things have the same price, then the same amount of human labor hours must have gone into those items, or that they're multiples of each other. So for example, if an iPhone takes X amount of hours and a tape recorder takes X amount of hours, and they're both the same, the idea is, well, then there must have been the same amount of average human labor that went into both of those things. And you can kind of objectively say, okay, then that should be what its price is. The price should be determined from how many hours somebody worked on something. That's basically what the labor theory of value is. But as we'll see, it's not as simple as some people make it. Sometimes people think, okay, well, as long as I spent a long time on something, if I say, hammering the ground with a sledgehammer, you may exert yourself in a lot of labor, but it's not worth anything. That's not what Marx is saying. He's saying that if item one costs has a price of $10, and item two has a price of $10, Marx's theory is that the human labor involved must have been about the same, and therefore you can come up with an objective way to measure value, and an objective way then to get to prices. But anyway, Karl Marx was not the first one to assume this to be the case. There were free market economists, kind of classical economists like Adam Smith, famous for his Wealth of Nations and his analogy of the invisible hand. Kind of, we can consider him as one of the kind of thinkers as far as what might be considered capitalist or free market economics. And then David Ricardo, also a great economist, Both of them, they didn't really talk about the labor theory of value very much, but they both kind of assumed it to be true. So it's not just Marxist communists who thought this, but as Marx was writing this stuff in the 1870s, he wrote at a time when basically all the assumptions and presuppositions of his theory were about to be proven incorrect. But to give credit where credit is due, Karl Marx did actually develop a way to try to test the labor theory of value, which no other economist had tried before. Instead of just assuming it, he wanted to actually scientifically prove the labor theory of value. And I think his methodology actually makes some sense. So to give him, again, credit where it's due, his methodology seems to be valid insofar as it goes. The problem is that Marx's methodology actually shows why his conclusion is wrong, shows why the labor theory of value is incorrect. So if Marx was actually consistent as a philosopher, his way of saying, okay, if we apply this method, we get to this conclusion. If he was really consistent, he would have seen that that the method he was applying showed why he was incorrect. But anyway, so he sought to explain this idea of the labor theory of value without just assuming it. So that's good. But anyway, here's a quote from a good online encyclopedia of economics that kind of defines and explains a little bit the labor theory of value under the entry for Marxism. And so here's what this online encyclopedia has, and this is linked in the presentation if you like that to read further. But it says the theory's basic claim is simple. The value of a commodity can be objectively measured by the average number of labor hours required to produce that commodity. So a commodity is like a good or a service. Okay, so let's say like a shirt. There were a certain amount of average labor hours in a society that go into making a shirt, is what Marx reasoned. And so he said, basically, that's where an item's value comes from. Now, he acknowledges there's different societies that are at different levels of development. So, for example, you could have a society that's very primitive, that you're making a shirt from growing your own cotton, all that stuff, and all the labor hours involved in that, and then putting it together in very kind of crude materials and something like that. Or you could have societies that are advanced and have things like sewing machines. And then therefore the human labor would be cut down. So what Marx said is, he said, okay, if you take all the laborers who are trying to make shirts and you looked at the average in skill and average amount of time it takes to make the shirt, that's how much human labor is required. And that's how many labor hours are in that shirt. Therefore, the shirt is worth X amount. Okay, so that's what the labor theory of value states, that it's basically the average of the basically skilled worker in a certain society, and how much time does that person how much does that person take on average to make that product beginning to end, or the persons involved. Okay, so you could add this to things that are more complicated that lots of people work on, like cars or something like that. All the human labor hours involved in that of the average worker would then give you the objective value of a car at the end of that. And so this would be, if it were true, this would be an objective way to measure value. And this is why it's important for Marxist communism, is because his argument is that there's that the capitalist comes in after the fact, bumps up the price and takes the extra for themselves, and that's where the exploitation in Marxism comes in. Okay, so he defines labor, we talked about this a little bit, as the socially useful and necessary human labor. So it can't just be anything. So I give the example of hitting the ground with a sledgehammer. Unless somebody wants to see that and is demanding that and is paying me to do that, Marx would say that doesn't count. That's not socially necessary. That's not socially useful human labor. So it has to actually be something that people want. So for example, like a shirt is something that people might actually want. So the labor can't be just directed anywhere. But these are the terms that he defined it in. It has to be, you can create something, for example, like a work of art, but people actually have to deem it socially necessary. They actually have to value that art. They actually have to think it's good. So for example, I've joked around with this example with students before, and they seem to think it's kind of funny. You know, when a 5-year-old draws a picture and the grandma values that quite a bit and puts that on the refrigerator, whereas if I'm not connected to that 5-year-old by some sort of relationship, I may not think it's very good art. So there has to be some type of, desire or demand for those goods or services that makes them valuable. But then that plus the human labor is where Marx says the value comes from. And he also admits not all labor is the same. A person digging ditches is not exactly the same type of labor as somebody performing surgery. But he believed that the doctor who performs surgery is just a multiple of the guy digging ditches. So let's say there's a guy digging ditches and the doctor performing surgery. He believes that if you multiply the guy digging ditches times the 10, times 50, times whatever the number is, eventually you'll hit the right number, and that will equal the same amount of labor hours of the doctor doing surgery. So he believes that labor is of whatever kind, skilled or unskilled, are multiples of one another. Okay, so anyway, so this is a way that Marx believes that you can kind of count the objective value involved in each good or service that he calls a commodity. And so he says that labor has to create what's called use value or utility. So again, it can't be arbitrary labor. It has to be useful to someone in society, meaning someone else has to demand it economically. People actually have to want that. And so this is how Marx defined labor. And going from here, let me give a quote of what he said was socially necessary labor time. He says you can measure basically the value of something by the amount of socially necessary labor time that goes into it. And so he said that this is where value comes from. He says the labor time required to produce any use value, which is basically just a useful commodity, good or service, could be a shirt, could be a haircut, says under the conditions of production normal for a given society. So whether that society is very primitive or has a lot of technology, you take the average of that, with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. So basically what Marx is saying is you look at an economic society, you look at how much labor on average does it take to produce an item like a shirt, how much technology and intensity does it take to produce that, and once you realize that number, you have an objective way to measure how valuable something is. And so if a shirt has the same amount of labor hours put into it as does a cell phone, then the assumption is they must have taken the same amount of human labor, which is not true experientially, but we could imagine that it could be true. And so Marx's basically way of how he defined labor and value is you have the average labor time that it takes to create a commodity that people demand, plus its usefulness, its use value. And that gives you an objective measure of value. Okay. Now, this is the whole theory on top of which rests the whole economic and philosophical system of Marx's communism, that labor is objectively defined by, or value is objectively defined by human labor. And therefore, you can develop from there, like Marx did, a theory of exploitation. So, moving forward, how does Marx prove what he said? And this is, I think, where Marx deserves some credit for going a little further than other economists or philosophers like Adam Smith or David Ricardo had gone in the past. How could you prove that labor is the thing that all goods and services have in common, that's what makes it valuable? Because that's what basically economists assumed, is that the thing that must be in common with cell phones, shirts, haircuts, Uber rides, whatever commodities, what gives them their value must be something that they all have in common, and that must be human labor. And so Marx develops a way to test whether or not this is true. And I think his way of testing it has some good things to be said about it. I think his methodology is kind of valid, although I thought about this a little bit more yesterday, and I think it kind of makes some assumptions that aren't necessarily the case. But even if it is valid, Marx makes a good point here, but he doesn't follow his own conclusion consistently. That's his problem. His idea is actually kind of clever. It's that let's think about all the commodities that somebody would demand: shirts, cell phones, haircuts, and let's see what they all have in common and don't have in common. We know shirts and cell phones and brain surgery are different commodities than each other. Well, what is it that they all share in common? And Marx said, if you can find that thing that they all share in common, that's what gives them their value. So it makes some sense. And he said that thing is human labor. And so he comes up with a way to test this. And the way I've kind of illustrated this, because it can get a little bit confusing, is I kind of think of it like a Venn diagram. And he does raise this important question of, where does value come from? Is it something that's objective, meaning that, so for example, I have a tape recorder that I use sometimes. Does this have an objective value based on human labor or the cost or something else? Or the contribution of Austrian economics is, or is it subjective? Is the value of this tape recorder actually in the minds of the people who want tape recorders or don't want tape recorders, and that's where its value comes from? But anyway, looking at Marx's way to test this out is this kind of Venn diagram. So let's say there's commodity one, which could be anything, could be a shirt, could be brain surgery. People want it, that's the demand, that's the use value, and it requires some type of human labor. Okay, fair enough. Now he said, okay, now there's something different. If commodity one is brain surgery and commodity two is the iPhone, we know that there are lots of differences between those things. Marx says, okay, well, what do they have in common? And if you isolate that between all goods and services, you find what gives it value. So kind of interesting. So he applies his methodology. But let me show you how how he applies it and kind of what the problems are with this. Okay. Problem number one, and this is stuff that I've thought about quite a bit, but I just realized this yesterday, is problem number one is this is logically self-defeating because it begs the question, and I'll come back to that in a second. It assumes something to be true without proving it. But we don't need necessarily Austrian economics or Adam Smith or Mises or Karl Menger or Milton Friedman or anyone else within or without the Austrian world who is not a communist to show that that this is incorrect. Marx himself actually walks into why the labor theory of value isn't true. Now, he doesn't admit that in his conclusion, but he basically proves his own theory to be false, which, I mean, if you want, if you're trying to be a philosopher, then that's probably pretty frustrating. But anyway, and I'll show you why. It's also not only logically self-defeating, there are plenty of commodities to which the labor theory of value doesn't apply. For example, we'll talk about like oxygen. Oxygen's valuable without any human labor being expended on it at all. So how do you explain something like that? So anyway, it's logically self-defeating, and it goes against, you know, things like works of art that go up in value over time, where the human labor in them stayed the same. So how can something be defined objectively by the number of hours of human labor that went into them, but then go up in value or change in value and price over time? And so anyway, the labor theory of value is proven by untrue, not from the outside, but it's actually proven true internally, that Marx showed why his own theory wasn't true. And this is kind of what I say about it, is to kind of walk people through to understand this, that if Marx's methodology is true, if how he gets to his conclusions is true, then he shows why his conclusion is wrong. But if his conclusion is right, then he shows the methodology that he used to get there is wrong. So he kind of frustrates his own theory. And so let me show you a couple examples of why that's the case. First of all, he shows, he walks into this elementary logical fallacy called question begging, which is basically the idea of viciously circular reasoning. Circular reasoning or question begging is when you try to presuppose or assume something to be true without proving it. And that's basically what Marx does. He says in his methodology, if you isolate what all goods and services have in common, that will show you where the value comes from. The problem with that is just because something has something in common, that doesn't necessarily mean that it shows you anything about its value. Things could have lots of things in common. That's assuming that the methodology will prove that where value comes from. You have to assume that in the premise to get that in the conclusion. And so it's a logical fallacy. The theory assumes that all commodities share one common factor. And then it concludes that all commodities share one common factor. And then for Marx, he says, well, that's human labor. So this runs into already an elementary logical fallacy. But even if we ignore that, it still has other problems. But a question to think about is, why must it be assumed that all commodities have something in common? Iron and corn don't necessarily have to have anything in common with each other. But Marx is assuming that they do as a presupposition without demonstrating that that's the case. And so, and then coming to that conclusion, but he's not, that premise can be debated. You can question that. So he asks, now here's another logical problem with Marx's labor theory of value. He asks the question, what do different, so let's ignore the question begging, the circular reasoning that's necessary for the labor theory of value, which would be, I think, enough to show that this is logically inconsistent. But he goes even further. He asks the question, which is an interesting one, a clever one. He says, what do different commodities, different goods and services all have in common? And he said in his premise, in order for labor to be valuable, it has the human labor, the element, but also it has to be useful to others in society. Okay, so you have to have both of those things. But here's the problem. Marx basically shows that all or a lot or even most commodities have those things in common, but he actually shows that commodities have two things in common, not just one. But then he basically crosses one out and just focuses on human labor. Let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, so here's that same Venn diagram that illustrates Marx's methodology. So remember, on the left, commodity number one, I said, could be brain surgery. Commodity number two could be the iPhone. Marx assumes that they have something in common, which will show us what their value is. And so he says the definition of any commodity is human labor plus demand. People have to want it. Okay, so that's how he sets up his premise. And then this is his result, that all commodities, it must have in common human labor and use value or social utility. Okay, so Marx has actually shown, according to his methodology and his writing, he says, okay, basically, I've shown that all commodities should actually have two things in common, not just one. So kind of interesting here. So he's shown that human labor is not the sole common denominator between all commodities. So what does he do when he gets to this point? Well, he basically says, let's just cross one of those out that doesn't go with my theory. And so this is what he says. This is the quote from Marx's Capital, Volume 1. He says, let's just ignore the one that is not human labor and then conclude that human labor is the only thing all goods and services share in common, and that gives them their value. So this is what he says. He says, if we disregard use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor. So he said, utility and use value is used to give you the definition of a commodity in the premise. But then when he gets to the conclusion and says, okay, all these commodities share two things in common, but we're going to ignore use value and just focus on human labor. And then he says, hey, look, all value comes from human labor. So this may be easier to understand, because I had to work my way through this with some careful thought to understand this. But basically, this is what Marx does. He says, here's brain surgery or any commodity. Here's the iPhone. What do they share in common? These two things. But use value or social utility, that I used in the premise, but I don't want that to be part of my conclusion, because then it messes up my conclusion that all value comes from human labor. So he says, let's just ignore it. And if you ignore use value or social utility, then basically all you're left with is human labor, which is the source of all value. So Marx becomes pretty arbitrary in his theory. He uses demand, human demand, people actually wanting the products, goods, or services to establish what a commodity is. But then when he sees that, well, wait a second, all commodities would need to have that in common, then he just throws it out the window and says, well, actually, human labor is the only thing they all share in common. A great economist named Böhm-Bawerk, who's an Austrian economist, during this time, he wrote a great book, kind of dense, but it's a short book called Karl Marx and the Close of His System. And he basically makes this illustration. He says, Karl Marx with his theory is like a guy who wants to prove that only white marbles exist and puts white marbles in a bag and then only pulls out white marbles. That's basically what he did with the labor theory of value. He says, well, if you ignore the things that don't go with my theory and you ignore use value, even though it's crucial to the definition, then you get the labor theory of value. but it's arbitrary. It's logically self-defeating. So now Marx is in a pretty serious problem here, that use value, basically human demand, or what Austrians would call subjective value, which means that people actually have to want it, and that's where the value and the price comes from. It's an abstract concept, not an objective thing. It's an idea in people's minds, is where value comes from economically. But Marx basically employs this idea of use value to give you a definition of a commodity, but then rejects it in his conclusion. So that means either his premise is wrong, his methodology is wrong, or his conclusion is wrong. But if any three of those things are not in place, that means his whole theory is inconsistent. And so he basically shows why his theory is not true. So let me show you kind of a different way of looking at this. So remember his definition of value. You take the average labor time of the average laborer given the technology that they have in a society, plus it has to be socially necessary. People actually have to want that commodity. That's where value comes from. That's how you get a commodity, a use value, according to him. How does he isolate where does value come from? So his methodology is, well, let's exclude everything they don't have in common and see what all commodities do have in common. And then he realizes, well, wait a second, all these commodities have in common use value and human labor, but I just want us to focus on human labor. And so he crosses out use value. So this is why I say, if his methodology is right, then his conclusion is wrong. And if his conclusion is right, then his premise and methodology is wrong. And so this is why I call Marx his own greatest critic, is because he doesn't need an external critique necessarily to show why Marx's communist economics is wrong. It actually self-defeats. It's a self-destructive system of thought. This is why I've on the back burner, I'd like to write a book someday called Not Even on Paper. Because some people say, well, communism's a good idea on paper, or it's a good idea in theory. But actually, it's not. It's not even a good idea in theory because it has these serious logical inconsistencies. And I don't blame Marx for getting something wrong. We've all probably made logical errors in our lives. But the problem is he's stuck to a conclusion, even though the premise and the methodology should have led him to realize that that conclusion was not the case. And so also, as if that wasn't enough, the idea of the labor theory of value also goes against experiential reality. And Karl Marx admitted this. Now, what do I mean by experiential reality? I mean, by the reality of experience, there are some goods and services that you can think of that are valuable regardless of the human labor. I mentioned works of art. I have a favorite Everybody Loves Raymond episode where his daughter keeps wanting to trade, and then the adults get involved that trade this Pokemon card. And I used to have students write down the prices and how many times the prices on the Pokemon card change throughout the episode. How does the price of something like that change so many times when the human labor that went in to produce that card was objectively the same throughout the whole episode? No, nothing changed in the labor, it just changed in the price. But there are also other goods and services that would be valuable without any human labor whatsoever. If you walked up and found a diamond on the ground, you don't need to know its past involving human labor in order to get a price for it or recognize it as valuable. And Marx actually acknowledges this. He says that, well, wait a second, there are plenty of goods and services and commodities that are valuable independent of human labor. But if that's the case, then the labor theory of value, which rests on the idea that value comes from human labor, is excluded, can't be true. And so the assertion of the labor theory of value is that all commodities are valuable because they have human labor in common. But that's not the case. Not all commodities are valuable because of human labor. Now, Marx gives some examples of this. I don't do this very much anymore, it's a waste of time, but recently I was commenting on something on Instagram where it was a page with some people who were friends, and I commented, made some mention of the subjective theory of value, which is the Austrian theory, which I think is the most correct because it's the most consistent. It doesn't have these logical errors. And somebody kept commenting on there and arguing with me, and I mentioned air. I said, well, wait a second. The air that we breathe is not valuable because it came from a past of being involved with human labor. And this person kept commenting back with me, and they're like, well, it does because it takes calories when humans breathe. But he was missing the whole point. And this is an example that Marx himself gave. Let me read a quote from Marx where he basically, I think these two sentences here basically show that the labor theory of value, according to, not to me, but according to Karl Marx, cannot be true. He says here, a thing can be a use value, meaning a useful commodity, a commodity in demand, without being a human labor value. Now, I added the words human labor value, but that's what he meant. He says basically a thing can be a use value without being a value, meaning it can be useful, it can be in demand, independent of any human ever working on it. And then he gives some examples. He says this is the case whenever its utility to man is not mediated through labor. Air, virgin soil, so basically land has some type of value to people, land that nobody's ever farmed or touched or done anything with, that can still be valuable even if no human worked on it. So how does the labor theory of value explain something like virgin land or air? Natural meadows, unplanted forests, etc., fall into this category. That's a pretty stunning admission from Karl Marx, who sought out to prove the labor theory of value. He says, well, actually, things can be a value without being a human labor value, which means that human labor is most likely not the source of where value comes from. And so commodities can have value independent of human labor altogether. But since that's the case, the labor theory of value cannot be true. And Marx demonstrated that. So it's basically, as soon as he gets the theory stated and tries to prove it, he also built into that proves why his theory is wrong. And even Marxists today, unless they haven't heard, they quit trying to prove the labor theory of value a long time ago, except for some people who just aren't aware of the problems. So they usually try to save Marxism or communism some other way. But anyway, if human labor is not the common factor of all commodities, that means the labor theory of value is false. So it gets even worse. Here's the Venn diagram. Marx wanted us to cross out use value and social utility. Basically, human demand is what he wanted us to ignore. But what he actually should have realized is that since not all goods have human labor in common, air, land, these things, he should have recognized, wait, there's somewhere else that we should look to determine value. And so basically you have to now cross out, it's the opposite of what he concluded. You have to cross out human labor, and that basically leaves what the Austrians started to conclude in around the 1870s to the 1920s, which is subjective value. Karl Menger, Eugene von Bavarick, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, they started to think, okay, well, wait a second. Maybe previous economists are incorrect in thinking the value comes from something in the commodity itself, the cell phone, the haircut, the shirt. Maybe the value comes from the abstract idea of it's valuable because people want it, they demand it because it, in their mind, satisfies a preference to satisfy a want or a need. Whatever that want or a need is, and we may disagree with each other on wants or needs. Some people want to buy pet rock on Amazon for 20 bucks, and some people don't. But enough people want it that it satisfies that idea of it's a subjective value, not something in the cost of production in pet rock, and not something from the human labor, but because people like it, people demand it, people want it because of their own psychic satisfaction that they derive from giving up something that they want less in order to get something that they want more. I'll finish up here with Marx's, and then I'll leave some time for questions if we have any, because I know this stuff can be fairly confusing. One of the reasons I put together this presentation almost about a year ago is I really wanted to understand this clearly. And so I'm like, okay, let me sit down and really walk myself through it step by step. So it can be a little bit hard to understand. But anyway, I'll let Karl Marx actually have the last word on this. This is his quote from his critique of the Gotha program. And he says, now this, remember, is the guy who says that labor is the sole source of all objective value in commodities. This is a quote from another one of his writings. He says, labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, useful commodities, and it is surely of such that material wealth consists, as labor, which itself is the only manifestation, is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. So basically, he admits value actually can come from sources other than human labor. It can come from nature. And this is where Marx, I don't have time to get into this, but this is where Marx gets into some trouble even further with his idea of materialism, his worldview that everything is just matter in motion. Because if the whole world is simply the product of physics, biology, and chemistry, and it's just that's the materialist worldview, then how do you ever distinguish that type of material like rocks from human labor? I don't think in a materialistic worldview you can make that type of distinction. But anyway, Marx, as good as admits here that labor, human labor, is not the source of value. And so in doing so, he basically proves why his labor theory of value is false. And if the cornerstone of all the rest of the theory of communism, exploitation, Marxism, all that, if that's false, then I think the whole rest of the theory crumbles with it. But often I think people don't understand that it's not just that Marxist communist economics are something that we don't like, or it's not just something that, if followed, creates bad outcomes, which it does, but it's something that's internally flawed. And so we have to search elsewhere for better economic explanations.